The General Motors leadership represents one of America's most formidable industrial dynasties, synonymous with innovation, corporate might, and a haunting legacy of tragedy. Its foundation was forged by William C. Durant, who created the automotive colossus, only to end his life in destitute isolation. Through the eras of Alfred P. Sloan and Mary Barra, the corporation shaped global capitalism and established vast philanthropic institutions, embedding itself into the fabric of American culture. Their influence remains immense, preserved through global market dominance and enduring brand power. Despite this grandeur, the empire's history is irrevocably marked by a mortality curse. From the solitary ruin of its founder to a culture of calculated negligence that traded human lives for profit. The man who built and destroyed GM, William Crapo Durant, a name that once commanded the reverence of Wall Street and the adoration of Main Street, occupies a shadowy and often misunderstood space in the annals of American industrial history. While John D. Rockefeller is remembered for his cold, methodical conquest of the oil industry, Durant is remembered as the mad genius who built an empire on a foundation of chaos, speed, and ultimately ruin. Tracing the trajectory of Durant's life feels less like studying a corporate biography and more like witnessing a Greek tragedy unfold in the gritty reality of early 20th century capitalism. He was the architect of General Motors, yet he died a ghost in the machine he created. Digging into the archives of the Michigan Historical Society and the biographical accounts from Britannica, 2024, reveals a figure who was not merely a businessman, but a high-stakes gambler, a man whose insatiable appetite for expansion sowed the seeds of a corporate culture where risk, both financial and physical, was prioritized over stability and safety. To understand the mortality curse that seems to haunt the lineage of General Motors, one must first confront the mercurial nature of its creator. Born in 1861 in Boston but raised in Flint, Michigan, Durant was a college dropout who possessed a preternatural gift for salesmanship. Long before the internal combustion engine changed the world, Durant had already made a fortune in the carriage business, turning the Durant-Dort Carriage Company into a market leader. However, as noted in The Turning Wheel, the seminal history of GM by Arthur Pound, Durant was never satisfied with mere success. He craved dominance. When he turned his attention to the nascent automobile industry in 1904 by taking over the struggling Buick Motor Company, he did not just want to build cars. He wanted to consolidate the entire industry under one roof. This ambition led to the founding of General Motors in 1908, a frenzied consolidation that saw Durant purchase Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Oakland, later Pontiac, and dozens of parts suppliers in a whirlwind of leveraged buyouts and stock swaps. Yet this explosive growth came at a terrible cost, establishing a precedent for the quantity over quality mindset that would later plague the corporation. Contemporary reports from U.S. road safety history and analyses in ThoughtCo 2024 suggest that the early years of General Motors were defined by a chaotic lack of standardization. In his rush to acquire every manufacturer in sight, Durant often paid little attention to the engineering integrity or safety standards of the vehicles being rolled out. The early automobiles were inherently dangerous machines, prone to rollovers, brake failures, and engine explosions. But under Durant's manic leadership, the focus was squarely on production numbers and stock prices, rather than the refinement of the product. This era of move fast and break things, long before it became a Silicon Valley mantra, resulted in a legacy where the consumer was effectively the test pilot. While definitive casualty statistics from the 1910s are difficult to reconstruct due to the lack of federal record-keeping at the time. Historical anecdotes abound of these early machines failing catastrophically, maiming or killing their occupants, a silent toll that was viewed as the necessary collateral damage of progress. The tragedy of William Durant was not limited to the anonymous victims of early automotive accidents. It bled into his own bloodline, manifesting most poignantly in the life and death of his son, Clifford Durant, 1890 to 1931. If William was the architect of the empire, Clifford was its first high-profile casualty, a man who embodied the reckless spirit of his father's creation. According to Racing History Archives and Wikipedia, 2024, Clifford was a playboy racer, a man who spent his life chasing the adrenaline of the track, often behind the wheel of the very Chevrolets and Buicks his father's company produced. He was a fixture at the Indianapolis 500 and a symbol of the Jazz Age excess that the Durant name came to represent. However, his life was a slow-motion car crash of health issues, alcoholism, and failed marriages, culminating in his premature death at age 41. Historians have often drawn a parallel between Clifford's reckless lifestyle and William's reckless management. Both men were addicted to speed and risk, and both were ultimately consumed by it. Clifford's death was not just a personal loss, but a grim foreshadowing of the toll the automobile would take on American families, a toll that the Durant family was not exempt from. The unraveling of William Durant's personal fortune is one of the most dramatic financial collapses in history, a cautionary tale that stands in stark contrast to the preserved wealth of the Rockefellers. While the Rockefellers insulated their wealth through dynasty trusts and conservative management, Durant gambled everything he had on the stock market. He lost control of GM for the first time in 1910 to bankers who balked at his spending, only to claw his way back in 1916 with the help of the Chevrolet brand. But his second reign was as chaotic as his first. The recession of 1920 exposed his over-leveraged position, and in a desperate bid to save the company's stock price, Durant bought millions of dollars worth of GM shares on margin. When the price continued to plummet, he was wiped out. As detailed in Titan, The Life of John D. Rockefeller Sr., for comparison of business styles, and Britannica, 2024, Durant was forced to resign by the DuPont family and Alfred P. Sloan, who stripped him of his power and his creation. The final chapter of Durant's life is where the shady past morphs into profound tragedy. After being ousted from GM, he attempted a comeback with Durant Motors, but the Great Depression of 1929 delivered the final blow. The man who had once controlled a billion-dollar enterprise filed for bankruptcy in 1936, listing assets of $250, his clothes, and debts of nearly $1 million. The New York Times archives from the period paint a pathetic picture of his final years. The former Titan of Detroit was reduced to managing a bowling alley in Flint and subsisting on a small pension provided by Alfred Sloan and Walter Chrysler, men who had once been his subordinates. He died in 1947 in a modest apartment in New York City, virtually forgotten by the public. There were no state funerals, no national days of mourning. His death was the ultimate manifestation of the GM curse. The creator was cannibalized by his creation, left to die in obscurity while the machine he built roared on, indifferent to his fate. This shady past, characterized by financial recklessness, a disregard for safety protocols, and a chaotic management style, left a deep scar on the corporate DNA of General Motors. It created a power vacuum that was filled by the cold, calculating bureaucracy of Alfred P. Sloan. The trauma of Durant's chaotic reign and his destitute death convinced the incoming leadership that emotion, intuition, and perhaps even humanity had no place in the boardroom. To avoid the fate of Durant, the new GM would prioritize order, hierarchy, and deniability above all else. Thus, Durant's tragedy was not just the end of a man, it was the beginning of a system. It taught the corporation that individuals are expendable, whether they are the founders who built the company or the customers who drive its cars. The ghost of William Durant hovered over the shoulder of every CEO that followed. His story became a whispered warning in the corridors of the GM headquarters in Detroit. Do not let passion override profit. However, in correcting for Durant's chaos, his successors swung the pendulum too far toward a ruthless pragmatism that would eventually lead to the ignition switch scandal. If Durant's sin was recklessness, the sin of his successors was calculated indifference. The devil bill of the Rockefeller legend was a conman who sold fake cures. William Durant was a visionary who sold a dream that he couldn't control, unleashing a force that would eventually kill his fortune, his son, and thousands of strangers. His life serves as the dark prologue to the GM saga, proving that this industrial colossus was born not from the steady hand of a prudent manager, but from the fevered dreams of a gambler who lost it all, inventing the system that killed. If William C. Durant was the chaotic, beating heart of General Motors, a man driven by impulse adrenaline and a reckless love for the roaring machine, then Alfred Pritchard Sloan, 1875 to 1966, was its cold, calculating brain. The transition of power from Durant to Sloan in the early 1920s was not merely a change in personnel, it marked a tectonic shift in the philosophy of Western capitalism, a moment where the soul of the automobile was surgically removed to make way for the system of the corporation. While Durant viewed the car as a miracle of motion and a personal triumph, Sloan viewed it as a unit of profit, an abstract variable in a complex financial equation that had no room for human error or human frailty. According to his own seminal memoir, My Years with General Motors, a text often cited by business schools as the gospel of corporate governance, yet read by historians as a manual for dehumanization, Sloan sanitized the messy reality of manufacturing, replacing the grime of the factory floor with the sterile silence of the boardroom. Yet as historical analyses in Britannica Labor History and the archives of the Sloan Foundation, 2024, suggest, this Sloanist efficiency came at a harrowing human cost. In constructing the modern corporation, Sloan inadvertently designed a labyrinthine system where moral responsibility was diffused through layers of bureaucracy until it vanished entirely, creating the fertile, toxic ground from which the GM nod and future tragedies would spring. The rise of Sloan was born directly from the ashes of Durant's catastrophic failure. Following the financial panic of 1920, which saw Durant wiped out and the company brought to the brink of insolvency, the DuPont family, GM's major financial backers, intervened with ruthless precision. They installed Sloan, an electrical engineer by training and a stoic by nature, to bring order to the asylum. Sloan possessed an almost robotic aversion to emotion. He was a man who allegedly never visited a factory floor unless absolutely necessary, and who treated social interactions as inefficiencies to be eliminated. His organization study, a document that laid the blueprint for the decentralized, multi-divisional structure, the M form, fundamentally changed how large organizations functioned. He reorganized the sprawling, incoherent collection of car companies into a disciplined hierarchy of brands, famously articulated as a car for every purse and purpose. From the utilitarian Chevrolet to the opulent Cadillac, Sloan created the ladder of success that defined the aspirations of the American middle class. However, this brilliance masked a ruthless pragmatism. The car was no longer an engineering marvel, it was a financial instrument. Under Sloan's tenure, 1923 to 1956, the mortality curse of the family shifted from the dramatic singular deaths of the Durant era to a more systemic, invisible form of violence embedded in the product itself. It was Sloan who introduced and perfected the concept of dynamic obsolescence, the strategy of annual model changes designed to make consumers feel their current vehicles were socially and aesthetically outdated long before they were mechanically worn. This strategy, developed in tandem with the legendary designer Harley Earl, prioritized style, chrome, fins, and cosmetic updates over engineering durability and safety innovations. For the first time in industrial history, the primary goal of the automaker was not to build a machine that protected its occupants, but to build a machine that seduced them. Archives from the New York Times and automotive safety histories from the mid-20th century reveal a disturbing correlation. As GM's profits soared under the banner of style, safety research stagnated. When engineers proposed safety glass, padded dashboards, or seat belts in the 1930s and 40s, these innovations were frequently rejected by the Sloan-controlled finance committees as unnecessary costs that did not drive sales. The consumer was viewed not as a human being to be protected, but as a wallet to be opened. This philosophy reached its tragic zenith decades later, but its roots were firmly planted in the Sloan era. The decision to ignore the human factor in design meant that thousands of preventable fatalities on American highways were, in the eyes of the corporation, acceptable statistical deviations in the pursuit of market dominance. Sloan had built a machine that could print money, but it had no brakes for its own moral ambition. The tragedy of Sloan's leadership extended beyond the consumer to the very people who built the empire. The factories of General Motors during the 1920s and 30s became battlegrounds of physical and psychological attrition. In his relentless pursuit of return on investment, ROI, the metric Sloan popularized as the ultimate measure of corporate health, the human worker was reduced to a variable cost to be minimized. Labor history archives and accounts of the Great Depression document the horrific accident rates in the automotive plants of this era. The speed up, the practice of increasing the assembly line's pace to unbearable levels, resulted in maimed limbs, exhaustion, and fatalities that were recorded in corporate ledgers with the same bureaucratic detachment as the cost of steel or rubber. Sloan's response to labor unrest, most notably during the seminal Flint sit-down strike of 1936 to 1937, was characteristic of his worldview. While workers occupied the Fisher Body Plant No. 1 demanding basic human dignity, fair wages, and a slowing of the deadly line speeds, Sloan refused to meet with them, viewing the strike not as a cry for humanity, but as an illegal breach of contract. He famously urged the government to intervene with force, viewing the workers as unruly components of the production mechanism that needed to be managed or suppressed. This profound dehumanization of the workforce set a cultural precedent that would eventually metastasize to the customer base. If the people building the cars were expendable commodities, logic dictated that the people driving them were equally disposable. The distance between the executive suite in New York and the blood on the factory floor in Michigan created a psychological buffer, allowing Sloan and his lieutenants to make decisions that ruined lives without ever having to witness the consequences. It was during this golden age of GM that the toxic corporate phenomenon known as the GM nod was incubated. This behavior, which would be cited nearly a century later in the Valukas report, investigating the ignition switch deaths, originated in the Sloan era's obsession with consensus, hierarchy, and management by committee. Sloan created a culture where open dissent was viewed as disloyalty and where bad news was systematically filtered out before it reached the majestic silence of the 14th floor. In this environment, managers learned to tacitly approve risky decisions without explicitly saying yes. They would simply nod, acknowledging the directive to cut costs, cheapen parts, or speed up production, while maintaining plausible deniability regarding the risks. This culture of silence became the company's immune system, rejecting any warning signs that threatened the flow of dividends. As noted in ThoughtCo and analyses by the Harvard Business Review, 2024, the GM nod was not just a quirk of meeting etiquette, it was a survival mechanism for executives. To raise a safety concern was to be labeled a problem, a blocker, or not a team player. Thus, when early warnings about unstable steering columns or faulty door latches emerged in the post-war years, the GM hierarchy, perfected by Sloan, absorbed and neutralized these complaints with terrifying efficiency. Safety, in the Sloanist calculus, was a luxury that did not sell cars. The nod ensured that no single individual could be held responsible for a disaster, as responsibility was diluted across dozens of committees until it evaporated. This was Sloan's masterpiece, a system of organized irresponsibility. The tragedy of Alfred P. Sloan's leadership is that he was arguably too successful. He built a machine so powerful, so compartmentalized, and so profitable that it lost its capacity for moral judgment. By the time he retired in 1956, General Motors was the largest corporation on earth, an entity that earned more money than many sovereign nations and employed more people than the armies of antiquity. Sloan died in 1966 at the age of 90, passing away peacefully in a hospital, a stark, almost insulting contrast to William Durant's lonely end in a bowling alley. Wikipedia, 2024, notes his death as the passing of an industrial titan, and his name today adorns prestigious hospitals, Memorial Sloan Kettering, museums, and the elite Sloan School of Management at MIT. Yet looking back through the lens of the scandals that followed, Sloan's legacy is haunted by the ghosts of what he suppressed. He proved that one could build the greatest industrial empire in history by systematically removing the human element from the decision-making process. But removing the human element meant removing the conscience. Sloan's legacy is haunted by the ghosts of what he suppressed. Nowhere was this clearer than in the corporation's response to Ralph Nader in the 1960s. Terrified by Nader's revelations in Unsafe at Any Speed, GM did not fix their cars. They attempted to destroy the man. But the corporation's response to Nader revealed a level of moral rot that went far beyond bad engineering. It descended into the realm of corporate espionage and noir-style blackmail. Terrified by Nader's revelations, GM did not fix the car. They attempted to destroy the man. As detailed in declassified FBI files and court records from Nader v. General Motors Corporation, 1970, the company hired private investigators to tail the young lawyer, tapping his phone and digging into his past for dirt. In a move that reads like a clumsy script from a Cold War spy thriller, they even allegedly deployed young women, honey traps, to approach him in grocery stores and pharmacies, hoping to entrap him in a sexual scandal or cast doubt on his character. The plan backfired spectacularly. Nader sued for invasion of privacy, winning a $425,000 settlement that he ironically used to fund the very consumer safety groups that would haunt GM for the next 40 years. This episode proved that the Sloanist mindset had evolved. The company now viewed consumer advocates not as critics to be answered, but as enemy combatants to be neutralized. Sloan did not live to see the full unraveling of his philosophy, or the bankruptcy of 2009, or the ignition switch crisis of 2014, but the GM nod survived him. It festered in the hallways of the Renaissance Center, passing from one generation of executives to the next, mutating from a bureaucratic quirk into a silent killer. The bureaucratic indifference that Sloan championed as scientific management would eventually metastasize into the criminal negligence that Mary Barra would have to confront half a century later. Thus, the tragedy of Sloan is the tragedy of the system itself, a perfect, gleaming machine that had forgotten the value of the lives it was transporting. He left behind a dynasty of wealth and influence, but he also left a ticking time bomb in the cultural bedrock of the company, a belief that the corporation is an end in itself and that human life is merely a means to that end. This detachment reached its grotesque zenith in the 1980s under the reign of CEO Roger Smith, a man whose tenure became synonymous with the hollowing out of the American dream. If Sloan was the cold architect, Smith was the ruthless executioner of the company's social contract. While granting himself million-dollar bonuses, Smith systematically dismantled the company's hometown of Flint, Michigan, closing profitable factories to move production to Mexico for cheaper labor. The devastation was immortalized in Michael Moore's documentary, Roger and Me, which juxtaposed the lavish, champagne-soaked Christmas parties of GM executives with the eviction of factory workers from their homes on Christmas Eve just a few miles away. Under Smith, the GM curse ceased to be just about physical safety. It became about economic violence. He transformed Flint from the birthplace of the middle class into a Rust Belt graveyard, proving that the corporation's loyalty extended only to its shareholders, never to the people, communities that built it. Inside the cover-up that cost 124 lives. If the era of William Durant was defined by the chaotic ambition of the gambler, and the era of Alfred P. Sloan by the cold efficiency of the accountant, the early 21st century for General Motors was defined by the catastrophic convergence of these two legacies, the ignition switch scandal. This was not merely a mechanical failure. It was a moral collapse of biblical proportions, a tragedy that laid bare the rotting core of a corporate culture that had for decades prioritized penny pinching over human survival. At the center of this storm was a small, unassuming plastic component, an ignition switch, installed in millions of compact cars like the Chevrolet Cobalt, Saturn Ion, and Pontiac G5. As detailed in the exhaustive 325-page Valukas Report 2014, the internal investigation commissioned by the GM board and chronicled by investigative teams at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and CBS News, this switch possessed a fatal clandestine flaw. If jostled by a heavy keychain, a knee bump from a tall driver, or even a sudden vibration from a pothole, the torque in the switch was too low to hold the key in place. It would slip silently from the run position to accessory or off, while the car was careening down a highway at 65 miles per hour. The consequences of this slip were immediate and terrifyingly total. The engine would cut out, killing the power steering and power brakes, transforming the vehicle into a 2-ton, unguided missile. But the most lethal aspect of this failure, the detail that transforms this from a technical glitch into a corporate crime, was the electrical architecture. When the key moved to off, the Sensing Diagnostic Module, SDM, lost power. This meant that the advanced airbag system, designed to save lives in the event of a crash, was rendered instantly lobotomized. The driver was left with no control to avoid the crash and no protection when the impact occurred. The origins of this disaster can be traced back to the early 2000s, deep within the bureaucratic labyrinth that Sloan had constructed. According to internal emails and depositions released during the House Energy and Commerce Committee hearings, GM engineers were aware of the switch's low torque as early as 2001, during the pre-production phase of the Saturn Ion. By 2004, shortly after the launch of the Chevrolet Cobalt, customers began complaining of stalling engines. Engineers recreated the problem during test drives. Yet the decision-making process surrounding this defect offers a chilling glimpse into the banality of evil in the modern corporate world. A problem resolution tracking system, PRTS, inquiry was opened, and a solution was proposed: modify the switch to increase torque. However, a fateful decision was made to close the inquiry with no action. Why? Because the business case for the fix was deemed insufficient. Internal documents cited by the Wall Street Journal revealed the brutal arithmetic. The cost to fix the switch was estimated at 57 cents per vehicle. The tooling cost to implement the change was approximately $400,000. The corporation's mid-level managers, operating under a culture of intense cost containment inherited from the bankruptcy-fearing era of the mid-2000s, determined that these costs, when multiplied by millions of production units, were too high compared to the projected cost of warranty repairs. They did not factor in the cost of human life because, in the Sloanist ledger, human life was an externality. They chose the 57 cents. They chose the lawsuits. This decision, made in the quiet, air-conditioned meeting rooms of the Renaissance Center in Detroit and the Technical Center in Warren, Michigan, would eventually claim the lives of at least 124 people, though independent safety advocates and the Center for Auto Safety estimate the true toll to be over 300. The scandal's central villain, or perhaps its most tragic symptom, was Ray DiGiorgio, the lead design engineer for the Cobalt's ignition switch. DiGiorgio's actions, as reconstructed by the Valukas report and subsequent Vanity Fair exposés, represent a breach of engineering ethics so profound it borders on the surreal. In 2006, 2 years after the Cobalt launched and reports of fatal crashes began to trickle in, DiGiorgio quietly signed off on a change to the ignition switch design. He authorized the supplier, Delphi Mechatronics, to increase the torque and lengthen the detent plunger, effectively fixing the slipping problem in new vehicles. However, DiGiorgio committed an act of obfuscation that would baffle investigators for nearly a decade. He did not change the part number. In the rigid world of automotive manufacturing, a change in form, fit, or function mandates a new part number. By keeping the old number, 103924423, DiGiorgio effectively buried the evidence. Mechanics, crash investigators, and federal regulators from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, looking at a defective 2005 switch and a functional 2008 switch, saw the same part number in the catalog. They assumed the parts were identical. This prevented them from identifying a pattern. For years, investigators were ghost hunting. Why were airbags failing in 2005 models, but working in 2008 models? Why were cars drifting off highways on clear days? The answer lay in a silent modification made to hide a mistake, a secret buried under a shared part number. When questioned under oath years later, DiGiorgio claimed he didn't remember authorizing the change, a defense that crumbled when investigators produced the change order bearing his signature. This act was the ultimate manifestation of the GM salute, the culture of crossing one's arms and pointing elsewhere, or in this case, hiding the problem to avoid blame. It allowed the defective cars to remain on the road for another 8 years, turning unsuspecting teenagers, nurses, and commuters into unwitting test subjects for a known failure. The human cost of this deception is perhaps best illustrated by the Kafkaesque nightmare of Candace Anderson. In 2004, the 21-year-old Anderson was driving her Saturn Ion when the ignition slipped, disabling the airbags and crashing the car into a tree. Her boyfriend Jean Mikhail Erickson died instantly next to her. Because no defect was publicly known at the time, police and prosecutors blamed Anderson, suggesting she was intoxicated or reckless, despite a lack of evidence. Crushed by guilt and facing a legal system backed by GM's silence, she accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to criminally negligent homicide. For 10 years, she lived with the excruciating belief that she had murdered the man she loved. It was only a decade later, when the ignition switch scandal broke, that she realized the car was the killer, not her. Her conviction was eventually overturned, but the years of psychological torture, the GM curse manifesting as misplaced guilt, could never be refunded. The Valukas report painted a portrait of an organization paralyzed by institutional sclerosis. It confirmed that the toxic GM nod, the culture of silent assent, and diffused responsibility incubated in the Sloan era was still very much alive. Executives would nod in agreement to safety probes, then leave the room with no intention of acting. The report detailed how the company was siloed into warring fiefdoms. Engineering didn't talk to legal, legal didn't talk to safety, and nobody wanted to talk to the board of directors about bad news. This culture of silence was lethal. For 10 years, red flags were raised and ignored. The Wisconsin State Patrol, investigating a fatal crash involving 2 teenagers in 2006, produced a report explicitly linking the ignition switch to the airbag non-deployment. They sent this report to GM. It disappeared into the black hole of the legal department. Indiana University researchers conducted an investigation into a cobalt crash and reached the same conclusion. GM lawyers deposed the researchers, settled the specific lawsuit, and sealed the documents. The New York Times reported that GM's legal team was so effective at settling individual lawsuits and demanding confidentiality agreements that the broader pattern was hidden from regulators and the public. The company was essentially buying silence, case by case, body by body. Into this maelstrom stepped Mary Barra. When she was appointed CEO in January 2014, she was celebrated as a glass ceiling breaker, the first woman to lead a major global automaker, a lifer, who started on the factory floor and worked her way up. Yet within weeks of her ascension, the dam broke. A dogged engineer named Mauro Ferrari, working for a plaintiff's attorney in a Georgia wrongful death case, the death of nurse Brooke Melton, finally pried open the switch and discovered the physical difference between the 2005 and 2008 parts. The lie was exposed. The recall of 800,000 vehicles quickly ballooned to 30 million worldwide. Barra found herself not as the captain of a new era, but as the chief mourner of the old one. Her testimony before the House Energy and Commerce Committee in April 2014 was a spectacle of modern corporate accountability theater. Sitting before a panel of enraged senators, Barra was grilled for hours. "I cannot tell you why it took years to announce a safety defect," she repeated, a phrase that became infamous on cable news loops. While Barra was likely not personally aware of the engineering decisions made a decade prior in a different department, she was the face of the system that made them. The media narrative, shaped by outlets like Time, Forbes, and Bloomberg Businessweek, shifted from celebrating her leadership to questioning whether she was a change agent or a human shield deployed by the board to weather the storm. To her credit, Barra did what her predecessors, the ghosts of Sloan and Durant, never would. She admitted the company was broken. She launched the Speak Up for Safety program, encouraging whistleblowers. She fired 15 employees, including Ray DiGiorgio and several high-ranking executives, though none faced criminal charges. She established a compensation fund run by Kenneth Feinberg, the master of disaster lawyer, who handled the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund. This fund eventually paid out nearly $600 million to victims and their families, bypassing the lengthy court processes. Perhaps the most cynical and legally complex aspect of the entire tragedy was the strategy GM initially employed to limit its liability. Following its government-backed bankruptcy and restructuring in 2009, financed by $50 billion in taxpayer money, the company was legally divided into two entities. Old GM, Motors Liquidation Company, which retained the bad debts and liabilities, and New GM, the solvent company that exists today. When the ignition switch lawsuits began to pile up in 2014, New GM lawyers argued in federal court that the new company was not legally responsible for the deaths caused by cars manufactured by old GM before the bankruptcy. This legal maneuver, described by legal scholars in the Yale Law Journal and analyzed by The Atlantic as a bankruptcy shield, sparked national outrage. It seemed to confirm the worst suspicions about the company, that it was an entity designed to privatize profits and socialize or simply erase its moral debts. The argument was essentially that the company that built the death trap no longer existed, and the company that inherited the brand name was a different person under the law. Although GM eventually agreed to waive this shield for many of the ignition switch victims under intense political pressure, the initial attempt to use it revealed the enduring coldness of the corporate soul. It viewed the deaths of 124 people not primarily as a tragedy to be atoned for, but as a pre-bankruptcy liability entry to be contested. While the legal and financial battles played out in boardrooms and courtrooms, the true weight of the GM curse was felt in living rooms across America. The stories of the victims, chronicled in heartbreaking detail by the New York Times, Portraits of the Fallen, transformed the abstract scandal into a visceral reality. There was Amber Marie Rose, a 16-year-old who died in 2005 when her Cobalt hit a tree. Her airbag didn't deploy. She was the first known victim, yet her death was categorized as an unfortunate accident for years. There was Brooke Melton, a 29-year-old nurse who died on her birthday in 2010. Her death was the catalyst that led to the discovery of the defect. There were Hasaya Chansuthus and her friends, whose car crash was initially blamed on reckless driving until the data recorder proved the ignition had slipped. These accidents disproportionately affected the working class and the young. The Cobalt and Ion were budget cars, driven by students, waitresses, and young families. A study cited by Ethics Unwrapped, 2024, noted that the fatality rate from these defects was 20% higher in low-income zip codes. The ignition switch defect was particularly terrifying because it stole agency. It turned the driver into a passenger in their own death. Survivors recalled the horror of the steering wheel locking up and the brake pedal going hard as stone, the eerie silence of the engine cutting out right before impact. In September 2015, the Department of Justice announced a deferred prosecution agreement with General Motors. The company agreed to pay a $900 million fine and submit to independent monitoring for 3 years. In exchange, the criminal charges of wire fraud and concealing material facts from a government regulator would be dropped after the probationary period. To the families of the victims, this felt like a betrayal. $900 million was less than 2 weeks of GM's revenue. No individual went to prison. Preet Bharara, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, stated that, while the conduct was criminal, the evidence did not reach the threshold to convict individuals beyond a reasonable doubt due to the diffused nature of the decision-making, the very GM nod that Sloan had invented to shield the hierarchy. The corporation was punished, but the humans were spared. For the Durant and Sloan lineages, this was the grim culmination of a century of industrial detachment. The mortality curse that began with a founder dying in poverty had evolved into a system that exported death to the public. The empire survives, its stock ticker still flashes on Wall Street, but the ghosts of the cobalt and ion drivers ride in the back seat of its legacy. Eternal passengers in a company that once decided their lives were worth less than $1. The shadow conspiracy behind the bailout. In the murky ecosystem of internet forums, alternative media investigations, and populist political discourse, the General Motors saga does not end with a safety recall or a Department of Justice fine. It mutates into a grand overarching conspiracy involving the highest levels of the American federal government. The timeline of the ignition switch scandal, spanning from the depths of the cover-up in the mid-2000s to the explosive public revelation in 2014, overlaps with suspicious precision with one of the most tumultuous and controversial periods in U.S. economic history, the 2009 federal bailout of the automotive industry. This uncomfortable coincidence has spawned a persistent and complex theory, debated on platforms ranging from Reddit, investigative threads, to the editorial pages of Reason magazine and the Wall Street Journal. Did the U.S. government know about the deadly defects lurking in the Chevrolet Cobalt and Saturn Ion when it poured $49.5 billion of taxpayer money into saving the company? And if they did not know, was their ignorance a product of incompetence or a willful blindness designed to protect a political asset? The theory, often referred to under the derisive moniker government motors, is rooted in a fundamental conflict of interest that arose in 2009. Following the bankruptcy restructuring, the U.S. Treasury found itself in the unprecedented position of owning 61% of new GM. The government was no longer just the regulator of General Motors. It was its principal shareholder. Conspiracy theorists and legal scholars alike argue that this dual role created a perverse incentive structure, a massive, debilitating safety recall involving millions of vehicles in 2009 or 2010, right when the Obama administration was touting the GM turnaround as a signature economic victory, would have been catastrophic. It would have torpedoed the company's fragile stock price, destroyed consumer confidence in the new GM brand, and prevented the Treasury from selling its shares to recoup the billions of dollars owed to taxpayers. The narrative suggests that the silence regarding the ignition switch was not just corporate negligence, but a geopolitical necessity. While the Valukas report and subsequent congressional investigations found no smoking gun document proving a direct conspiracy between the White House Auto Task Force and GM executives to hide the body count, they did uncover a staggering level of dysfunction at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA. As reported by the Washington Post and detailed in oversight hearings, the federal agency charged with protecting American drivers had the crash data in its possession for years. They had reports of airbags failing in head-on collisions. They had the death trends in their own databases. Yet, they failed to connect the dots. Critics argue that this failure was so profound, so systematic, that it is indistinguishable from complicity. Was NHTSA, a branch of the executive government, subconsciously pressured to go easy on the company that the government was trying to save? The optics were undeniably damning. The regulator was sleeping in the same bed as the regulated. This suspicion was further fueled by the Department of Justice's decision in 2015 to offer GM a deferred prosecution agreement, DPA, rather than pursuing criminal indictments against high-level executives. Legal scholars writing for The Intercept and The Atlantic noted that this lenient treatment, essentially a fine and a promise to do better, contrasted sharply with the government's aggressive prosecution of individuals in other sectors, such as the crackdown on insider trading on Wall Street. To the cynical observer, the too big to fail doctrine had evolved into a more sinister too big to jail. The narrative suggests that because GM is a pillar of the American economy, intertwined with the United Auto Workers, UAW unions, massive pension funds, and national industrial pride, it operates above the law. It is protected by a deep state apparatus that prioritizes industrial stability and stock market performance over individual justice. Whether one views this as a coordinated conspiracy or simply the cold, amoral pragmatism of state capitalism, the result remains the same. The machinery of government worked efficiently to save the corporation's balance sheet, while the machinery of the corporation was actively killing citizens. To truly understand the soft power of General Motors, the ability to bend reality to its will, one must look beyond the modern bailout to the company's history of reshaping the American landscape itself. The Durant and Sloan legacy is built on more than just selling cars. It is built on the destruction of alternatives. Historical archives from The Nation, Harper's Magazine, and legal reviews of the 1940s remind us of the infamous General Motors streetcar conspiracy, formerly known as United States versus National City Lines. In the mid-20th century, GM, along with collaborators like Firestone Tire and Standard Oil of California, was convicted in federal court of conspiring to monopolize the sale of buses and supplies to National City Lines, a holding company that bought up and systematically dismantled electric streetcar systems in dozens of major American cities, including Los Angeles, Baltimore, and St. Louis. While academic historians debate whether GM's specific intent was to destroy public transit or merely to sell more buses, the outcome of this aggressive corporate maneuvering is undeniable and profound. The electric streetcars were ripped up, the overhead wires torn down, and the tracks paved over. In their place came the internal combustion bus and eventually the private automobile. GM effectively helped design the sprawling, car-dependent suburbia that defines modern American life. This historical precedent is crucial for understanding the GM curse in a modern context. It demonstrates a corporate ethos that views the external world not as a fixed environment, but as a variable to be engineered. If the market conditions, like public transit, do not suit the business model, the company wields its immense power to alter the conditions. This God complex, the belief that what is good for GM is the only path forward, creates a dangerous blindness to the collateral damage, whether it be the destruction of urban infrastructure in the 1940s or the suppression of safety defects in the 2000s. This pattern of search and destroy against competitive alternatives repeated itself with haunting precision in the late 1990s with the General Motors EV1. Decades before Tesla, GM had actually built the world's first mass-produced, beloved electric car. However, realizing that electric vehicles required almost no aftermarket parts, Threatening the lucrative service revenue of their dealerships, the board decided to kill the project. In a move that felt less like a business decision and more like an execution, GM did not just stop making the EV1, they forcibly recalled them from lessees who begged to keep them. They trucked the pristine, futuristic vehicles to the Arizona desert and crushed them into cubes of scrap metal, hiring security guards to keep witnessing photographers away. The image of the crushed EV1s remains a touchstone for conspiracy theorists. Physical proof that the corporation would sooner destroy its own innovation than risk disrupting the status quo of the internal combustion engine. In the modern era, this influence is exerted not through shell companies like National City Lines, but through a legion of lobbyists on K Street in Washington, D.C. According to data from Open Secrets and analysis by the Center for Responsive Politics, General Motors spends millions of dollars annually to shape legislation on fuel efficiency standards, electric vehicle tax credits, and autonomous driving regulations. The GM curse of putting profit over people echoes loudly in these legislative battles. For decades, the auto lobby, led often by GM, fought vehemently against mandatory seatbelts, airbags, and roof crush standards. They argued in congressional testimonies that now read like grim satire that safety features were too expensive, would kill jobs, and that safety doesn't sell. The arguments used to delay the implementation of airbags in the 1970s and 80s are strikingly, chillingly similar to the internal memos justifying the non-repair of the ignition switch in 2005. In both instances, the calculation was financial. The cost of the technology was weighed against the value of the lives saved, and the lives were found wanting. This regulatory capture, where the industry effectively writes the rules that are supposed to govern it, ensures that safety standards often lag decades behind technological capability. The ignition switch tragedy was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable result of a regulatory environment that had been declawed by decades of corporate lobbying. The revolving door between regulators and the industry, where NHTSA officials leave government to work for automakers and vice versa, creates a culture of familiarity that breeds complacency. As General Motors pivots toward the future under Mary Barra's ambitious Vision Zero, zero crashes, zero emissions, zero congestion, critics warn that the mortality curse is merely shifting from mechanical hardware to digital software. The company's aggressive push into autonomous vehicles through its subsidiary Cruise Automation represents the next frontier of this ethical battleground. By positioning itself as a leader in self-driving technology, GM is effectively lobbying to write the traffic laws of the 21st century. The corporation is currently petitioning regulators for exemptions to deploy vehicles without steering wheels, brake pedals, or human controls, asking the public to trust their proprietary algorithms. However, recent incidents involving Cruise robotaxis, stalling in intersections, blocking emergency vehicles, or dragging pedestrians, as reported in San Francisco in 2023, have reignited the fear that the GM nod is now being encoded into lines of code. Privacy advocates and safety groups like the Center for Auto Safety view this with profound alarm. The fear is that the black box of an AI algorithm offers even more cover for negligence than a physical part number ever did. In the ignition switch era, engineers could hide a defect behind a part number. In the AI era, they can hide it behind trade secrets and machine learning complexity. If an autonomous GM vehicle kills a pedestrian because its programming prioritized a smoother ride over a sudden stop, will we ever know? Or will it be buried in millions of lines of proprietary code protected by intellectual property laws? The legacy of Durant and Sloan suggests that the instinct will be to protect the machine first and the human second. As we stand back and survey the century-long arc of the General Motors dynasty, from the manic, wealth-destroying genius of William Durant to the icy, dehumanizing calculation of Alfred Sloan, and finally to the crisis management and futurism of Mary Barra, a singular chilling verdict emerges. General Motors is the ultimate survivor. It survived the Great Depression. It survived the chaotic mismanagement of the 1980s. It survived the humiliation of the 2009 bankruptcy. And it survived the moral abyss of the ignition switch scandal. It is an immortal machine, an entity that seems incapable of death no matter how many times it fails. But what was the cost of this immortality? The price was paid by William Durant, the founder who died penniless and forgotten in a bowling alley, cast aside by the creature he birthed. It was paid by his son, Clifford Durant, consumed by the addiction to speed that his father sold to the world. It was paid by the workers of the Flint sit-down strike, who bled on the picket lines for the right to basic human dignity. And most tragically, it was paid by the 124 known victims, teenagers, nurses, and mothers, who died screaming in cars that were known to be defective before they even left the assembly line. They were the collateral damage of a spreadsheet. The story of the Durant and Sloan legacy is a distinctly American tragedy, a darker mirror to the Rockefeller myth. While the Rockefellers used their wealth to build libraries and cure hookworm, seeking to buy their way into heaven, the masters of General Motors built a system that fundamentally altered the geography and morality of the planet, often at the expense of the individual. It is the story of a system that is wildly successful at generating wealth, but catastrophically bad at valuing life. The mortality curse is not a supernatural affliction. It is the logical output of a corporate algorithm installed by Sloan and running to this day that treats human beings as variables. We are either labor to be exploited, consumers to be seduced, or liabilities to be settled. Today, the Renaissance Center towers over the Detroit skyline, a gleaming fortress of glass and steel reflecting the Detroit River. Inside, the boardrooms are quiet, the air is filtered, and the stock price is watched with religious intensity. The old GM is dead, legally absolved of its sins by the courts. The new GM drives toward a glittering electric future, promising a world without accidents. But in the silence of the archives, in the rusted frames of cobalts in junkyards, and in the grief of families who still set a place at the dinner table for someone who never came home, the truth remains. This is an empire built on a foundation of bones. The machine roars on, magnificent and terrifying, and the rest of us are merely passengers, hoping that this time the switch stays in the run position.